In this video, I'm going to remove and replace the power steering rack on my 2003 Chevy Trailblazer Extended with a 4.2-liter 6-cylinder engine. This video is created from clips from my 7-part Project Trailblazer front-end rebuild series. That's why you'll see my Blazer in various states of disassembly throughout the removal and replacement of the steering rack. One quick point to note is that having other parts removed from the front end will make getting to some of these bolts a little easier than if they were still in place. If you're interested in watching the 7-part series of Project Trailblazer, click the link in the description below. Enjoy the video.
Here's what we got. We got a bad steering rack. There's a seal on the outside here that's busted and it's leaking power steering fluid, which explains why I'm having to fill it up so frequently.
Alright, so I've got the Trailblazer on the patio, the steering wheel straight. In order to keep the steering wheel from moving, I'm just going to ratchet strap it to the front seat. Got the front end jacked up and on jack stands, and I chalked the rear wheels. And for good measure, I'll pull the emergency brake.
Alright, so I'm going after the steering rack. First thing I'm looking at is the reservoir, how much fluid's in it. This thing has a pretty severe leak, so it's actually empty. Otherwise, I would get a turkey baster and suck out the fluid.
Alright, the first thing I'm going to do to get the steering rack out is remove this cotter pin and 21mm castle nut on this tie rod end link. I'm going to do this to both sides. I'm going to be pulling the steering rack end links and all from the parts Trailblazer and swapping it over to our good Blazer. If I were to be purchasing a brand new steering rack, I would have to remove the end links from this steering rack and put them on the new one. In order to get the end link out, I'll need to loosen this 7/8 nut from the end of the link at the rack.
Alright, I took some WD-40 and a wire brush and I cleaned off the threads on this end link here to make it easier on myself.
Before I remove the end link, I want to take this measurement from the notch to the end of the steering rack. Noting this will help me put the end link into the steering rack at the same distance. Doing this will keep the front end as close to the original alignment as possible. When it's all said and done, I'll be taking the truck in to get it professionally aligned. Alright, with that nut loose, I'll go after this 21mm castle nut.
That was easy enough.
Sometimes end links don't play nice, and I've had to use a fork tool like this one to put in between the end link and the spindle and just hammer it in. It pries it right out. Alright, with everything loose, I can remove the end link. Just going to put a wrench on the end here like this and turn it counterclockwise until the end link comes out.
Underneath the truck, we've got this brace here. I'm going to need to get this off so that I can just drop the power steering rack straight down.
I'm going to remove this plastic cover right here. There are 4 15mm bolts holding it in place. Technically, I only need to remove these 2. Now I'm going to go after this large metal plate that's underneath the steering rack.
There are actually 3 15mm bolts right here, 2 up the top and 1 low in the bottom. The one low in the bottom is the one we want to get out. Alright, now I'm going after the steering column bolt. Just lift this rubber boot up right there, and it's a 15mm bolt. Just need to undo that. If the bolt was going this way, it'd be so much easier to undo. Okay, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but just above the drive shaft, I've got a 1/4 inch drive extension, an 8mm little socket, because there is a small 8mm bolt that's holding in the power steering fluid lines into the steering box. So it's a little tricky getting that in there. I've got my bucket ready to catch any fluid that comes out. Alright, I'm underneath the driver's side. You can see where I've unplugged those two lines. That 8mm bolt did the trick, and just took a little screwdriver and put it between the plate and the steering box and kind of wiggled it loose and got the lines out. So go ahead and pull out this whole steering rack now.
Alright, I'm on the passenger side of the vehicle trying to get the large bolt that holds the steering rack into place. You'll see that I've got my large spark plug socket, and I'm using like an 11/16 box end or something. I've got my left hand holding a breaker bar on the head of the bolt. I'm using this closed end wrench and my spark plug socket to get the nut off the end of the bolt. I couldn't get a ratchet, I couldn't get a breaker bar on this side because you'll see the axle is in the way. So a little tip to help you get that nut off easily. You'll see that I'm repeating the process on the driver's side. This is a 13/16 socket using a breaker bar. You see at the bottom of your screen I'm using that box end wrench and my spark plug socket. What's neat about that spark plug socket, it's got that hexagon shape on the end that looks like the head of a bolt. It certainly makes this go a lot easier.
Okay, passenger side bolt is pulled. Driver's side pulled.
Alright, she's free. Let me show you something up close. Here are where the lines go in and out of the steering rack. These are the hose seals. I call them button seals, but they're very important. They need to be in there to keep the fluid from leaking out profusely. When I pulled the steering rack off of the parts Trailblazer, one little button seals fell out. I didn't really realize it till I started to install it, and I kind of noticed it at the last second. So you got to make sure that those seals are in place, or you're going to have a major problem on your hands. Well, it's a pretty straightforward process to get the steering rack out of a Trailblazer. Just got to make sure the fluid's out. Got to take all those bolts out of that bottom plate, remove the end links from the spindles. The hardest part really for me was getting that 8mm bolt out of the lines that go into the power steering rack. Take care of that 15mm bolt that's holding the steering column to the rack. Then you got those two large bolts that hold the power steering rack to the frame of the vehicle. You take those puppies out, and Bob's your uncle. So that's the easy part. The tricky part's putting it all back together.
Okay, I'm getting ready to install the steering rack. You can see the main bolt lineup right there and right here. This is the power steering lines, and then we've got the steering knuckle back up in here. So I need to line up that with these bolt holes here and down there. Should prove to be a little bit tricky doing this by myself, but I'm going to attempt to do so. Well, we got the steering rack in. It's just held in by the long bolts right there at the top. This extra jack was very helpful to be able to hold this side up while I got the driver's side bolt in and then got the passenger side in. So that's it for me for tonight. Alright, first thing I'm going to need to do is remove the bolt and drop the steering rack, and then lift it back up and try to align my steering box with my steering column and get that bolt back in there. Alright, we're going to put the bolt back in, but first I'm going to put just a little bit of this thread locker on there so this bolt doesn't go backing out on me. Alright, I finally got the steering rack and the steering column shaft bolted together. Whenever I first put the steering rack up and I would try to get the bolt hole to line up, the steering column shaft seemed to be like 1/8 of an inch short, and I could never get the steering rack to push up high enough to get it to line up the bolt hole. It took me forever to figure out that the shaft itself can move up and down, in and out, and what I had done is bumped that shaft inward and it wouldn't line up the hole. So I took a screwdriver through the hole of the steering column shaft and I pulled it down, was able to get the steering box to kind of line up, and eventually using some prying with the screwdriver was able to get the shaft to line up perfectly and got the bolt in. So it was really a booger to get back in, and it was quite frustrating at times. So it's finally bolted together, so we're gonna go ahead and hook the lines back in, tighten down the bolts for the steering rack. Okay, we got the power steering lines back into the steering box. There's that little 8mm bolt. It's pretty tricky to get that back in there, especially if you got big hands or fat fingers or something.
So it would be at this point that I would be putting the end links back into the steering rack had I taken them out before. Again, that measurement that I showed you earlier would come in handy right now, so I'd want to screw this end link in to that same distance that I had taken the original end link out. Oh yeah, and I can't forget to tighten down that 7/8 nut up at the steering rack.
Now that that's hooked up back in, we can put some power steering fluid in this thing and make some progress. Alright, now that I've got the power steering fluid in, I'm going to turn the vehicle on, and I'm going to turn the steering wheel all the way to the right, and then all the way to the left, and go back and forth, until we get all the air bled out of the system, and then we're going to add power steering fluid as it needs it. Okay, you can hear that power steering whine quite a bit when it first started. We should be able to pop this cap and see some air bubbles. Since the steering rack was just swapped over from my parts truck, it was pretty much full, so I didn't have to add a whole lot to the system. Just needed to fill the reservoir, and we'll probably need to top it off. Hear that under pressure. Well, there's not a whole lot of air bubbles down in there. We'll do this a few more times until the power steering pump quits whining like my kids. Alright, so we're going to do that a few more times after the truck's all put back together and it's back on the ground under its own weight. Power steering pump will work a lot harder at that point, so we'll try that again when it's all buttoned up.
Okay, with the steering rack in and the tie rods bolted back to the spindles, I can now put this plate back on underneath the truck. I've got 4 21mm bolts, I think 8 15mm bolts, and then I'm going to put the plastic cover back on over the oil pan, and this thing will be ready to put back down to earth. And then we'll fire this baby up, and we'll turn the steering wheel all to the right, bump it all the way left, and bump it, and then we'll do this until the power steering pump quits whining, all the air comes out of the system. I'm going to make sure to check the fluid level, keep it topped off as necessary. Well, there you have it. That's how I replaced the power steering rack on my 03 Trailblazer. I saved myself a couple $100 doing the job myself. I'd say the hardest part of the job was getting the power steering lines back into the steering box. It was a tight area to work in. Check out my channel for other repairs, and if you like what you see, please consider subscribing. As always, thanks for watching, God bless, and be sure to hit that like switch on your way out. See you next time.